Okay. Um, so I've been using Against the Odds magazines as my bathroom reading recently. I got far. Normally, it's my fiction or whatever. Um, I don't really have the time right now because of my addictions to to really sink into a work of fiction or a historical book or anything of that nature. So I decided my one Constant World Expo shirt, the only time I registered in advance to get one. Uh, the so anyway, this has been my normal kind of bathroom reading and cooking or something like that if I need something to read. And these are really fine magazines. Like, I think in terms of production quality, they blow any other magazine I've seen except maybe Via Victus, but I can't read that, so at least not without way too much work, like looking up every third word. The magazines themselves are high quality. I've been pleased with the games that I've played from them. I kind of wanted to cover the magazines in conjunction with the games when I get to them, but who the hell knows when I'm going to get to the games. And there's almost always a guest article by, a known and notable designer. The first thing, my Fog of War discussion, was triggered by an article by John Prados looking at the Columbia block games. And in this case, it's the designer of Britannia, Louis Pulseifer, I guess. Now, the Britannia series, many people have done games similar to what he did with Britannia, is not only very popular, I've gotten a lot of enjoyment out of it. But this discussion is because I guess Britannia, and I'm definitely someone who does this, is railed against for being too much design for effect. And maybe I don't use those words. I didn't hear the words design for effect until I joined BGG, and people like Charles Vassy and whatever were mentioning it. And I realize, right away, design for effect as put forward is sort of the exact antithesis of what I want from a model of a situation. But Pulseifer makes an interesting, he brings up the concept of design for cause, which I've never even heard the term of, except maybe in discussions about design for effect. Because the truth of the matter is, I don't think anybody sits down and says, I'm going to design for cause. What they say is, I'm going to model something, right? And these are the salient points that I want to talk about. So this entire article is something of a straw man, because the argument isn't, pure design for cause versus pure design for effect. If you did those two, design for cause would probably be impossible. You could something like the old computer game that was also done physically. I've played it physically. The Game of Life, not the Milton Bradley game, but the little one that showed organisms growing and spawning and whatnot. That's a design for cause, like pure and simple, right? There's a world that's postulated and it's completely built out, and then you can just see, what distributions of organisms are survivable and which aren't. And it's meaningless because it's not really a model of anything. It's in and of itself, it's a very abstracted representation of population densities. But it's a fun little thing to program on the computer. But for the most part, people don't make games and say, I'm designing for cause. People make games to present a model which shows you, well, there's two reasons to make games, right? One is to provide a diversion, okay? That's not really meant to model anything, and that maybe has some sort of linkage that helps you build the story, helps you remember what is useful for what, but the mathematical model underneath is really just designed for competitive qualities and ease of play and stuff like that at various levels. And it may have some representational aspects to it. And sort of the worst side of this is the Euro, where things are just labeled something, and you could relabel them, you could theme them, as it were, and on the other side of it, the side where you are trying to show more realistic connections between various causes and outcomes, is your war game. And when people start talking about design for effect, what they're saying is they're making the war game less of a war game, right? That's how I see it. Now, if you see chess as a war game, okay, so you're just about the thematic representation rather than any kind of realistic attempt to model, right? I don't think Paul Cipher is doing that, though. I don't think he views himself from what I've looked at of his article, but he's basically creating a straw man of this design for cause idea as the opposite of design for effect, when in reality what you have is a continuum. Now, in the case of Britannia, what you have is fixed victory point locations that are places you want to go to, without any explanation of why you want to go to them, without anything in the game that develops and drives your need to go to them. It's just a menu of places you need to go. I would say that that's not pure design for effect any more than it's pure design for cause, if anything exists of that nature in a complex system. What it is more of a continuum where the cause for effect was used as a cover term for, well, I don't want to go into those details. Now, what's interesting is I without reading this, and without realizing who it was who wrote this, I recognized the name, but I didn't link it to what game it was, to what he's known for designing. And I'm sure he's designed other games as well. But that's his, that's his crowd, and now where did I get myself lost? Yeah, before I while I was playing Empire Builder, and still am, I came up with this because I was discussing. I don't even know why. Oh, for some of the articles in this that have nothing to do, articles in this that have to do with the fall of, with the fear of the Western. Of the West from the East, why the West feared the East for so long, and why all the invasions came from the East, and just that nugget in there that like certain population pressures have been determined to be, why things are moving. And I thought it would be very interesting to build a more Britannia history of the world type game that reflected that side of things better than either of those systems do. And it would be more complex, and it would, be a different focus, but it would be taking a different look at the same sort of historical events with a different alignment. So there are causes in Britannia. You choose not to go into a mountainous region because it's harder to fight there and you don't have enough manpower. There are things like that present there. It's not pure design for effect. On the other hand, why you're seeking out those victory conditions that you are, some of which seem completely kind of random, like, wait, why do the Dubliners want to go here for like one turn? What are they doing? And it's just sort of this, a lot of the Britannia locations that you're seeking, that you're going to get victory points for, all kind of vaguely make some sense. This is where they historically settled, so you want to direct them there. You don't have to go into too much detail, but it'd be nice to know why the Dubliners needed to take York. Like, just that story. I mean, I wish that little note was somewhere that I knew, because that one has always troubled me. For the rest of it, the conceit in Britannia, well, it's a very light game, and it doesn't want to go into a lot of details, and it says these things are worth points to these people just to direct them where they're going. And I can understand abstracting. So any game abstracts away certain things. And it's perfectly reasonable to say, yeah, why are the Normans invading? Why did the Romans come across? These things were not forced. There were a lot of factors way behind the scenes that drive that. And that argument is perfectly reasonable. If you're just talking about, because the victory conditions drive you towards certain things, that makes some sense. It can be misused, though. So take a look at Gettysburg. I'm perfectly happy with a game which gives terrain points, victory points, for holding, Cemetery Hill, for holding Culp's Hill. Most of the games do. Because if you are going to fight Gettysburg for real, that is your victory condition, right? That's what centers and forces the fight to happen the way it did. And just like Britannia, that's what forces you to get to certain locations. But in and of itself, that doesn't say it's designed for effect. That says this particular cause, while not the reason the battle happened, well, yeah, I guess you could say there's a design for effect implication there, because, if you truly were to fight out the Gettysburg campaign over a huge amount of territory with the goals of, don't let Lee get north, and destroying each other's armies or whatever, well, that would be a different situation, and you probably wouldn't end up fighting at Gettysburg very often. If you take a look at, I think I've played the campaign, Civil War campaign series for Gettysburg. I seem to remember that I did. And it just doesn't have to happen the way it did. Gettysburg itself is not of importance. What's of importance is the factors that led to Gettysburg for that. But once you decide that you're going to model the Battle of Gettysburg, if you don't put those terrain conditions in, you might not end up with the right situation. As an example, when I played Austerlitz, which had no terrain points for it, there's a problem, because there's no reason for the coalition to actually attack. It's a really dumb idea. Their army can't handle it. And the system gives the attacker a real penalty. So there should have been a bit of scripting in there. And that's actually what I see, the victory conditions in a Gettysburg, in a terrain-based game, where you give points for terrain, or in Britannia, I see those victory points as scripting rather than pure design. Like when I think design for effect, I think black boxes that you can't really tinker with, right? Things, I'm trying to think of what. CDGs are a good example of a design for effect type concept, right? You're trying to limit the amount of movement that the armies could make. Well, you're trying to limit the amount of movement on the board in the game to what the armies actually did. And it wasn't really a matter of resources or necessarily energy coming from the top pressing things to happen. In a lot of cases, it just seems to be fate, but the CDG, instead of roll to see if you can move this unit, or roll to see if it does what you want it to do, which is still random, and still can create the same results in terms of overall actions, etc. It puts it into the hands of fate entirely, instead of putting it in the hands of the player to make a decision where the effect is that they will not get more movement, more forces moving or whatever, and more coordination than historically happened, but they will control it better, right? They can, to me, the argument against design for effect is not this idea that we're not modeling all the causes. And I mean, Pulsifer goes into this idea of, butterfly effect, and one man can make a huge difference and everything. I grant you all that. I say that luck belongs in every game, and at some point or another, a whole bunch of shit gets abstracted away as luck. In Britannia, it's the die rolls for combat that are the primary luck factor, right? The fact that the victory conditions are predisposed is just this is not an important facet, it is pre-assumed. Just like the terrain locations at Gettysburg. I want to create something that will develop like reality in one way. And I have very little disagreement with that. Dice for combat are a jump in abstraction, right? So if you're just using buckets of dice to hit with, these huge groups of migrating people who have some warriors with them and everything, it's a perfectly reasonable thing. There's so much going on there that you can't model that all. To me, that's not dice. That's not what I would consider design for effect. And I think that's kind of the problem here, is maybe I'm misusing the term, but when I hear the term design for effect, what I tend to see it as is putting aside, not talking about the level of abstraction, which is what he's mostly arguing about here, although the victory conditions is not a matter of abstraction. I mean, it is. Level of abstraction is really a matter of what details are important. And I think it's perfectly reasonable to say that all the intricate maneuvers on the military level and the fact that there's populations moving around there behind the scenes and everything, all that can be abstracted away and put into one counter that it is the equivalent of both armies and people in some sort of representational way, and I'm fine with that. I'm fine with abstracting shit away. What I'm not fine with, and the victory conditions are kind of sort of this, is making the players making choices that are not really based on realistic options, right? Now, taking options away, forcing people down certain paths, that's scripting. It's a form of abstraction, just like the dice are. But what I'm looking at more is I can choose, I'm choosing to do something and to not do other things when the actual commander-in-chief was not making those choices. They may have sent off letters, hey, can you get your forces moving? Can you do this? And they just happen to have, the right commander in the right place. Did you get Green or did you get Gates there, right? So to me, when you're talking design for effect, you're talking about things like, oh, well, the bad weather card. CDGs are where I hear it the most. The bad weather card that you control, that just represents overall friction. Yeah, but why do I control that? Why do I control that? Why can I change, if it were a die roll game, it would be like I'm able to change an opponent's die roll for, which units they can move. Or I can change my own to ensure that I get to move them. Or, I can swap out my, whatever. Design for effect to me leads to gamey solutions that are not really representational of anything. They're not saying, I'm this massive layer of abstraction that you can't penetrate, which scripting and die rolls are, right? No one is arguing. I don't think anyone argues for a purely deterministic world where if you knew all the causes, you could put it together and build it all up. Now, there is a different problem, and I've talked about this at other places, which is that complexity versus accuracy and realism question. A lot of people say, oh, it's the most realistic game ever because it covers all this stuff in detail. Probably not. Chances are when you put too many systems together, even if those systems seem to work individually rather well, they grind against each other and something doesn't quite work in them. Okay? And that's where the design for effect side of things has its best argument, which is that if you're putting too many details in, too many systems that are well tested on their own, you end up grinding the gears and you get something that will generally be ahistorical, may not even be able to be historical. Things like Le Grand Guerre come to mind, where, you just get loss numbers that are absolutely wrong. The armies can't recover from them at all. But the subsystems seem right. You get the same thing with Terrible Swift Sword for the Gettysburg stuff, where it's because something key was left out, right? The units are allowed to move and fight way more than they did historically. Longstreet took half of day 3 before he got his ass in gear, Why? Well, the answer to that particular part of a very large set of factors is the command acceptance in the brigade series seems to try to cover some of that. Another factor that covers it is fatigue rules, which, can be put in play. Each layer of complexity, you could dig down and make more and more complexities to try to write the problems that your incomplete level of a lot of detail tried to handle. Or you can design for effect there, and here I'm using it for the abstraction though again. So I'm trying to figure out what it is. When people use the term design for effect, it's usually not an abstraction that is the thing that grates on me and why I feel like they're using that term. When they use that term, I feel like what they're doing is covering up, and this may be wrong, this may be the misuse of the term, but this is what causes it to disturb me. When they use that term, it almost always feels like, oh, well, this makes a playable system and it comes out historically accurate, even if even if the decision making isn't appropriate at the level of the person making the decisions. Area impulse games is another system that comes to mind with this. Chit pull. But I go, you go as well. You know? So with chit pull, you're trying to get rid of the problem of I go, you go, which is, look, everything's moving at once. Both are what I would call design for effect. So the idea that you have pulses, chit pull, anything except simultaneous movement is really a design for effect set in play. And then the question becomes, does this do a better job, and on what things, and what things is it worse on? Because yeah, very clearly, I would say I go, you go is not an abstraction. It is a falsification. Chit pull is not an abstraction. It is a falsification. The idea that, oh, this force is moving right now and none of the others are moving is just wrong, right? The opposite side to that is things like SFB and Car Wars, where everything's moving at once. Hard to do when you're modeling a tactical battle, though, right? It was much, much easier to put that design for effect level in to make the game playable, manageable, yet still, by interleaving the pieces of the turn, the different sequences in properly, you're able to get something that gives you a historically believable result from those subsystems, even though the subsystems themselves are pure bullshit. And that's where I go with design for effect. Design for effect is pure bullshit, right? Now, it's necessary bullshit, but it's bullshit. Whenever you're using design for effect, what you're doing, in my opinion, is you're trying to make something playable, fun, a more enjoyable, competitive spirit, like, playing out. There was a game where you played out gunfights with poker hands or something. That makes no sense, But yeah, and you can make some hand wavy type of explanations of why it's more or less okay, and you can make modifications to that core principle that make it a little better. So, for example, with the I go, you go movement, well, if that's interleaved properly, let's say we're looking at a tactical, firepower game like Gettysburg. One person moves, then the defender gets to shoot, then the attacker gets to shoot. If you did it so that one person moved and got to attack, a la, in the old CRT games, although those CRTs kind of cover for some of it, you're able to kind of say, okay, well, there's something sensible here. As I'm moving forward, I'm not shooting as. So, it makes sense to take away the, to give the defending position an advantage in the firepower by getting first shot. They may break the opponent before they even get their shot, but as long as shots are small enough increments, that's not going to be this big a deal, right? As long as turns are small enough slices, it's not going to be that harmful. Chit pull tries to do something similar, which is that effective positioning, there's a whole bunch of stuff that gets in the way of movement, right? Movement rates are almost never constant. You run into problems in the terrain. People get tired. They get hot. Commanders delay their orders. This, that, and the other. And by doing the chit pull system, what you're not seeing this force moves. Boom. Now this force moves. It's not what's happening. What's happening is a layer of bullshit to let you simulate some of the uncertainties and delays that allow one unit to get to position A before another unit gets there, when maybe it wouldn't have been that. Maybe it doesn't look like it should be that way, right? And there's a layer of abstraction there, in the sense that it's abstracting away the orders, the difficulties on the terrain, all this shit that could be handled either through subsystems or through movement with a die roll or something like that. It's also abstracting away the fact that it's simultaneous movement, which I Go You Go does already. But that side of it is the bullshit side, right? That's the part that's problematic. If you had plotted movement with some randomness in it, all movement was then resolved simultaneously with that randomness played out, and then the players react to it within that situation. You'd have sort of the realistic situation, and you get that in your real-time strategy games to some extent, right? Except maybe they don't randomize enough. The movement rates are fixed or whatever in too many of them. So it's kind of interesting because I never really considered the concept of design for cause, which he brings out here, and to me that's just that's what modeling is about. Games are models. He admits to that. Modeling is about showing the causes, the input, and what the output would be from that input. And the fact that there's, a randomizer in there, that's fine. I don't think you can model something of this nature without randomizing, because there's way too much input. It's not a deterministic system, as far as we know. And even if it is, we're not capable of seeing it to that degree. So when he talks about design for cause, he puts forward something that I see as a straw man, which is designing for all the causes. No. No one does that. No one admits to that. It's just that the word design for effect, the term design for effect, and I don't know if it's used for abstractions the way he's using it here. I feel like it's been used more for what I call bullshit, where it's not simply an abstraction, it's a system which deliberately misrepresents what's going on in order to create the appropriate effect. And that effect, in design for effect, is the historical outcome, right? But scripting doesn't fit under that. Scripting's not bullshit. Scripting is, these are your limitations. This is the mental state of the commander. This is what they know about. That is actually modeling certain fixed inputs, right? Terrain values, more problematic, because not in the Britannia sense, in the tactical battlefield, in the Gettysburg sense. More problematic because neither commander is there in order to occupy that terrain. That terrain is a vehicle for taking a defensive position which blocks a certain outcome. Could that be changed? Yeah, it could be. So take a look at Gettysburg. I don't remember the road that's going off, but the road that goes out behind, I don't know if it's Baltimore Pike, it might be, that goes out behind Cemetery Hill. That road is the important part. If Lee could push to there, that's where the problem is. And that's why the big outflank makes more sense, right? Because the big outflank forces Meade off the hill, off the good terrain. But there's other good terrain that he could fall back to, which means that you could degrade that position without fighting the army and force it back, and then you're left with, yeah, but we came to fight a war game, not just to maneuver around and force him out of the way. Now, there could be restrictions on that, which is that, you know, the Confederates have to maintain a line going back in their direction. But to a large extent, they weren't really counting on that, you know? But forcing the Union back doesn't really do their solution either. It doesn't really... Part of the problem is Lee didn't know what the fuck he was doing at Gettysburg. Like, that whole campaign was kind of thoughtless. And for all the greatness that people place on Lee, you don't ever feel like he had a real solution. He was hoping to destroy the Army of the Potomac somehow. He had many brilliant successes, yet he couldn't destroy it. And destroying it was impossible. And there's sort of a, okay, well, you know, how do you really rate this guy? Because he's tilted at windmills, you know? But what do you do with him in that kind of circumstance? Well, the outflank doesn't serve his purpose. It doesn't destroy the Army of the Potomac. It may force them back into a position where he could achieve one of his goals, though, but not at the scale of the Battle of Gettysburg. Anyway, like I said, those victory conditions are problematic because, again, they raise a bullshit flag, right? I don't care about that hill. But if you don't put it in there, the game breaks, which is what I saw at Austerlitz. The game breaks. You don't put terrain situations in, and the players don't try to play in a role-playing sort of aspect, right? So, and that's one of the things, you know, you can always leave it up to the players to, you know, try to be reasonable. Empires in Arms has this problem, man. The rules as they sit encourage ahistorical behavior. And that I see as really problematic. I love the game, but yeah, it really, and then you look at something like Europa Universalis, which is sort of a stepchild of Empires in Arms, and there may be some bad behavior encouraged, but there's also like just this, wow, you just can't accomplish certain things that were historical. But that's a different matter entirely. That's just that's the subsystems don't quite fit together, and in fact the systems don't quite fit together, and you're really unlikely to get anything like a historical result from that. But in Empires in Arms, the things that the victory conditions kind of drive you towards, it's actually kind of like designed for bad effect. Like, it doesn't create the historical at all, and it's not really reflecting the causes either. It's just designed for fantasy, as far as I can tell. So I would consider Empires in Arms a fantasy game. Then there are a lot of the big games that kind of work out that way, and that's sort of the fight between scripting and trying to put things in the right tenor. But I mean, yeah, it's just a matter of the victory conditions just being absolutely wrong in those games. Whereas when you give them, you give somebody the Cemetery Hill victory conditions, and you can have a really, really fucking detailed subsystems and subsystems for the fire combat, for melee, for orders, for all kind of stuff in there that all handles everything perfectly. But if you didn't do that bit of bullshit as to what the commanders are actually trying to do at the battle, you're just not going to get the same. You're not going to get anything like the battle, right? You're going to get something that just doesn't work, that doesn't drive the battle. And I think that's an interesting concept there to consider. But for the most part, when people use the term design for effect, they're not using it to cover the everyday bullshit that we accept, right? They're not saying, well, I made it I go, you go because I wanted to design for effect. No. What they're generally doing with design for effect is adding additional layers of bullshit that we're not used to when they say that. And then you really have to investigate those layers, but you should also investigate the layers of bullshit that we do accept, and in terms of replacement. So when you look at the question between I go, you go, chit pull, and I don't know, I guess some other kind of pulsed behavior, but chit pull is essentially pulsed. What are you getting out of it? And honestly, the pulsed system that the victory games came up with, or at least I feel like they did the most of it, is perhaps the most problematic because it gives the control to the players, right? I decide to move this command. I decide to move this command. Then I pass. And you see this in like Vietnam and Korea. I think these are brilliant games. But there the bullshit is more in the player's control than it is in I go, you go, where, it's just the system and the players react to it. In chit pull, where it's just the system, but it's a more random system and players react to it. In the pulsed systems tend to have some randomization as to how many pulses you get. But they feel a lot like the CDG level, where you're giving the players too much control. Anyway, I think we've babbled enough and are not going to resolve anything. But I want to thank Mr. Pulseifer for his straw man because it got me to thinking along these lines and realizing that what he was arguing for, I wouldn't call design for effect at all. It's abstraction. And abstraction in and of itself doesn't qualify as design for effect. To me, design for effect is where you not only are ignoring the lower levels of detail, but where you're actually at the level that you're looking at, bending things, making things that seem unrealistic and unbelievable at the system level. So, the I go, you go movement. People don't move that way. Forces on the field, some of them may be standing still, but it's not one side standing still and the other side moves. Then it just doesn't happen that way, right? But it also doesn't happen where just this force is moving, and then just this force, and then just this force, That doesn't happen either. And the fact that it does that in the system, that is design for effect to me. It's not abstraction. It's true bullshit. And it's put in place not for reasons of simulation value, but more for playability or enjoyability of the play, right? Because there is a solution there, it's just not an acceptable one. All right, up it goes.